over the last few years, I have spent a lot of energy, a lot of effort in trying to grow more cover crops in my garden. And I want to grow more cover crops because I know that these particular plants can be really great for soil health and maintaining and enhancing that soil microbiome. There are so many other reasons as well. They can be ecologically beneficial in different ways, right? Supporting wildlife, like maybe birds or beneficial insects, or maybe they can help to facilitate the fixation of nitrogen in the soil, or maybe they can provide a lot of food and or shelter for pollinators. And so I haven't just tried to find cover crops, but I'm also trying to really work with and learn from different crops that already, or different plants that already exist in the local landscape. And one of these plants that I've worked a lot more with recently is called bittercress. So there are many different species of bittercress out there, over 200 in fact. And I'm only going to address 2 of them today. The bittercress is in the cardamine genus, and the 2 species I'm going to talk about today is cardamine pennsylvanica and cardamine hirsuta. Now, cardamine pennsylvanica is actually a native species, right? So some of these cardamine species are in fact native to North America. However, some of them are not, like the cardamine hirsuta, which was introduced from Europe. Now, some of these cardamine species look very similar to each other, especially the pennsylvanica and hirsuta, right? Usually pennsylvanica might be a little bit smaller. It might not have so many leaves at the base of the plant, not like the hirsuta does, which might look a little bit more bushy or leafy in appearance, especially down at the base, right? But both of these species, they're almost like kind of similar to spring ephemerals in a way, in that they bolt and flower early in the spring, disperse their seeds, and then completely die back, at least until the next fall. I've found for me that they tend to be a really good supplement into cover crop mixes, because where maybe other plants might not grow, or where other plants, there might be gaps in between certain plants, this bittercress can really kind of fill in the gaps. So the bittercress, of course, as I kind of alluded to earlier, is a winter annual. And so for clarity's sake, the plant will sprout in the fall, right? The seeds are dormant during the summer, they sprout in the fall, and they form a basal rosette and grow pretty slowly throughout the winter. And then once it starts warming up in March or so, at least in this zone 6 to 7 climate, then they begin to bolt. So one thing I want to mention too is that the bittercress leaves are of course a kind of classic mustard type shape, right? We have compound leaflets, we have 2 or 3 sets of leaflets that branch out laterally, and then we have one somewhat larger terminal leaflet at the end of each leaf structure. So that's a pretty good identifying characteristic for a lot of these cardamine species. But of course there can be variation from species to species. In terms of the flower, these plants are in the brassica family, so they are cruciferous, and they're called cruciferous because of the shape of the flowers. We can see that we have a 4-petaled flower here, so it's cross-shaped, cruciferous. It's all derived from the same Latin root. Now this plant is also really cool in that it is an early season nectary. When hardly any other plants are in flower, this plant is, right? Along with the common speedwell. And so these plants flower, and when they flower, they provide pollen and nectar to beneficial insects like syrphid flies, tachinid flies, and some of these other beneficial pollinators, right? Drawing them into the landscape and providing them with a food source so that these beneficial insects, these predatory insects, can be around before the pests begin to emerge. And that's really important, especially when we're talking about natural pest control. So of course it's a brassica, it's a cruciferous plant, so it is in the greater mustard family. And so as cover crops, these brassicas largely share a lot of overlapping characteristics in that many of them can help to promote disease suppressive soils, right? A lot of these brassicas can be nematicidal, right? They can kill nematodes that can attack other crop plants, right? They can also knock out certain pathogenic fungi. However, in certain instances, they can also kind of knock back beneficial fungi like the mycorrhizal fungi to some degree, right? So you want to be careful with their use. You don't want to overuse them, and you want to use them responsibly, and they can help to build soil health, right? So these brassicas, they don't depend on fungal or a lot of bacterial associations for their roots to get their nutrients. So they tend to be a little bit more aggressive against certain forms of soil life than other plants might be. Now, when these brassicas are terminated or tilled into the soil, they can form certain compounds. Probably glucosinolates are involved, and that is where they really go to work in killing off a lot of these pathogens in the soil and promoting the growth of certain disease suppressive microorganisms. Now, it's usually a good practice to not plant other brassicas like crops like turnips or cauliflower or cabbage where you had a brassica cover crop, because a lot of the brassica cover crop that is being broken down by other microbes may harbor microorganisms that may cause disease on other brassica family crops. Now, a lot of brassicas have the benefit of being deeply rooted, such as the tillage radish or some of these other brassicas that are used as cover crops. Now, the bittercress does not have that, right? It's very shallow, it's pretty shallow rooted, so it's a really good companion to other cover crops, right? Where it's not going to be competing for the same soil root zone, right? It's going to be a little bit more shallower than winter rye or some of these other cover crops, right? So it's a plant that can help to be used to fill in the gaps in between other plants and not compete for nutrients and not stress out the other cover crops so much, right? But with that, it also does not have the advantage that other brassicas do in breaking up soil compaction and things of that nature. And the other thing I want to mention about Pennsylvania bittercress is that its seed dispersal method is through what's called explosive dehiscence. And essentially what that means is when the seed pods dry, they mature, and when you brush up against them with your hand, the seed pods will literally explode, right? Sending their seeds a few inches or a few feet out from the original plant. And that's how they disperse their seeds so that they can grow the next season. Now, I have kind of figured out a way to harvest these seeds. It's definitely not a perfect method, but it is fairly effective, at least for my needs right now, at least until I think of something better. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a perfect system, because as I'm harvesting seeds to plant someplace else, I'm also kind of planting them at the same time in a way as well. Now, among a lot of people, homeowners or farmers, certain species of bittercress may be seen as invasive, right? Especially the ones that aren't native to North America. But in my own opinion and my own experience, these plants are fairly easy to terminate, right? Even if you just stirripo them before they flower and set seed, in a garden bed. And these plants disperse their seeds not super far away from the parent plant. And they're pretty small plants too. They're not going to be really shading out a lot of other crops, not only because of their small size, but also because they grow a lot earlier in the season than when we even plant most of our crops. So these plants grow in almost the exact opposite time of year than most of our garden crops. But if you are going to plant the bittercress as a cover crop, it's generally recommended that you prioritize planting the native species. So thank you so much for checking out this video on the bittercress and how I am using it in the garden, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Take care. And one of these plants that I've worked more with recently is called bittercress.